let's talk for a bit about how we capture our stack of photos. And we can put aside trying to stack photos without a tripod. I mean, there are a few photographers out there who actually do this, and there's one who does a pretty good job of it. But why add an unsteady variable to this equation when stacking is hard enough even as it is when we have it on a tripod? So we are working on a tripod, and preferably a solid tripod and a stable head at that. And we're going to shoot long or short stacks. Now, a short stack is just a few layers, enough layers to capture the subject from front to back. But with short stacks, our success rate depends a lot on the subject that we're shooting and the physical distance from the front to the back of the subject. If we shoot something fairly flat, we might get away with it. However, if we're shooting anything that's round, like a ball or a balloon, then short stacking probably won't cut it. Spherical surfaces require many incremental layers to capture the constantly changing distance in a sphere. There's no free lunch, so keep that in mind. With product photography, like shooting a photo of a camera lens, I can take a short stack and usually come up with a decent photo most of the time, especially if what I need the photo for is simply as an illustration. But the moment I get into a finished nature photo, like a flower with a bulbous shape, we're talking about getting the shot probably on a focus rail with much, much smaller increments. I mean, you can take a shot with 10 or 12 layers or one with 100 layers. It's a totally great difference between how the two look. Because remember that focus stacking is sampling. We're sampling something, then we're skipping over a whole bunch of the subject and sampling again. If we skip over too widely, if the gaps are too large, we get what are called artifacts. And there's something that they're visibly destructive to our eye. I mean, we look at them and they take away from the beauty of what we're trying to do. If I'm on a tripod, if I'm using a lens like the Voightlander 125 macro APO lens, this is a lens that has a very long focus throw, something like 630 degrees, I don't remember exactly. This means that the focusing helicoid, which is what we call just the focus barrel on the lens, it has to turn at least once, 360 degrees, and preferably twice to go from close to infinity. So when we have a lens like this, effectively the lens barrel becomes our focusing rail. Now, if I'm shooting at another great lens like the Coastal Optics 60mm f4 with a focus throw of only 210 degrees, and there's some with only 90 degrees, then every time I turn the helicoid, the barrel, even a little bit, I'm taking a huge, or at least a large, chunk out of my subject and leaving gaps in the stack that probably are just too wide. And so those artifacts are going to for sure be there. Anyway, the idea is that lenses that we have with a short focus throw need to be placed on a focus rail if you want to have a successful stack. In other words, the focus rail is a great equalizer for all lenses, no matter how large their focus throw is or isn't. And the bottom line is that in general, we are better off placing the camera and lens on a focus rail than just trying to have the camera itself on the tripod and shoot. But there's a lot of other problems to consider, and here's one of them. When I first got my into larger sensor cameras like the D3X and then currently the Nikon D800E with its very large 36mm sensor, I began to notice some minor but annoying problems when stacking the resulting images, the layers. It had nothing to do with the D800E because the problem happened only in the stacking program, not in the camera itself. And the problem is that with Serene Stacker, which is my stacking software of choice, the two main modes of stacking, which are called PMAX and DMAP, no longer lined up just exactly perfectly like they did on smaller sensor cameras. There were some very slight but painful differences between the two modes, to the effect that when I tried to retouch using one on the other to paint in, there were slight differences that made the retouching in some cases just not worth even trying. Now the good news was that with the DMAP, which is one of the two stacking modes, with the D800E Nikon, is almost perfect in itself because of the higher resolution. So this was puzzling to me, and this problem that the two modes in Serene Stacker were not working well enough together. So I took it to Rick Littlefield, who's the author of Serene Stacker. And one thing about Littlefield that's incredible is that he's unerringly interested in every facet of not just his program, but having anything to do with stacking and related topics. So he studied the problem and he came up with the following solution. In the stacks that I'd been doing using the D800E, I would place the camera with its lens on the camera, on a focus rail, and then move the whole ensemble incrementally forward for stacking, as opposed to fixing the camera lens on a tripod and then turning the lens helicoid. This, Littlefield pointed out, can make a difference, which I was unaware of. It had to do with what's called the entrance pupil, and it's a little bit complicated, but not really. And it's important that you understand it. At least it was important for me to understand it, so I'll do my best to explain it. Every lens has an entrance pupil and an exit pupil. The entrance pupil is always in front of the physical diaphragm. As you look down the front of the lens, we can see the diaphragm. That's the physical diaphragm. And the exit pupil, as you look down the front of the lens, is always just behind the physical diaphragm. Now, we don't need to concern ourselves here with the exit pupil, but only with the entrance pupil. And here's the thing. As you look into the front of the lens, all we can see is the diaphragm. Now, the entrance pupil is the image of the physical diaphragm as distorted or as seen through the various glass in the lens. It kind of floats there. Now, we think we're actually seeing the actual diaphragm, but really, in reality, we are only seeing the image of the diaphragm as seen through the glass. Make sense? So this image that we're seeing is called the entrance pupil, and it has a physical location within the lens barrel, even though it is only an image. In other words, the entrance pupil is a virtual image. So the bottom line is that the entrance pupil for any given lens determines how stacking programs can handle the images. And the ideal situation would be that if the entrance pupil could stay fixed, and then the camera could incrementally move on its own. So this did shed light on my problem. As there's no chance of this if I'm mounting the camera and lens on a focus rail and then moving them together as a unit along the rail. But I could instead go back to using the helicoid to stack by turning the lens barrel, and with some lenses that will work better. Also, some lenses naturally have what is called back focus, although there are not many of them. But one of those is the new, fairly recent Nikon 35mm f1.4G. It has what's called back focus, and it will hold that entrance pupil fixed and to move the rest of the stuff behind the diaphragm. The best of all worlds would be to use a bellows. one where I would fix the front standard with the lens and then move the camera on the back standard while the lens stays stationary. In this way, we can be sure that the entrance pupil does not move at all. The problem that I have with this solution is that with a lens like my old favorite Voightlander 125 APO lens, it's not useful to mount that lens on a bellows and then move the camera from behind, because the lens was built for its particular function and it's drastically altered if I were to put it on a bellows. So it just is what it is, and that's why it's such a great lens. If I start messing with it, it gets ordinary fast. However, an enlarger lens like the APO L Nikkor 105 works perfectly as a bellows lens, since it was originally designed as an enlarger lens. So I tried that, and sure enough, the resulting Pmax and Dmap images matched perfectly again, and there were no more problems with stacking if I did it this way. Now, the sad thing is I can't stack everything on a bellows, because I will continue to use all of the various lenses that I love, but at least I understand that I have a solution at hand by using the bellows should I need it. So the skinny here is that if you want to send the best possible stack to your stacking software, here are three choices in descending order of quality, the first one being the best. Number one, as we've talked about above, mount the lens on a bellows. Fix the front standard of the bellows and only move the rear standard with the camera. In this way, the camera body is moving back and forth, but the front lens and that entrance pupil is fixed. This is the preferred method. Now, if you have one of the very few lenses that actually have back focus, like the Nikon 35mm f1.4G, then you can just use that on the camera on a tripod and you're all set. The second best choice, and this is the one that most of us already use, just turn the focusing barrel, what's called the helicoid, on the lens like we usually do. This is the second best option, and that's why we look for a lens with a smooth but very long focus throw. If you have that, you kind of have a rail built right into your lens, and you just move it very, very gently, very, very slowly, a tiny bit at a time, and you're going to be able to create a lot of layers. Now, the third and least best, and the one that I've done a lot of, and often it works, is mounting the camera and the lens on a focusing rail and then moving the whole thing along the rail. Of course, this requires that we have different kinds of lenses, including ones that we can mount on the front of a bellows and work with, as well as the ones that we already just put on the camera and work with. So with this in mind, let's take a look at some of the focusing rails that are out there. Most of us have had a go-around or two with various focusing rails for close-up and macro work. At least I have. And I'm telling you this not because I'm an expert on rails, but because it appears that I've made all of the mistakes that are possible, perhaps, and in my search for a good focus rail, and I've unintentionally kind of accumulated enough of these devices so that I can actually compare them one to another, and that's what I'm going to do here a little bit. In general, the more that you pay for photography equipment, the better the quality you get. However, with focusing rails, at least in my experience, this does not hold up. You can pay a lot for a rail and still have one that does not function well. So this video is a kind of a guide to a few of the more common focusing rails with notes on them from my experience, and these are just my opinions only. So first, let's look at what is needed. What do we have to have in a focusing rail? The problem with most rails is that most of these rails have a 1/4 inch 20 screw on the top and a female 1/4 inch screw thread on the bottom. So if you're like me, you are used to using quick release clamps, and these would have to be added to any kind of rail that doesn't have them, increasing instability and making the rail more vibration prone. And I'm not about to screw a camera on and off a rail or screw a rail on and off a tripod more than once or twice, period. I've been there and done that. Sooner or later, something gets stripped and you're in big trouble. That being the case, then we need some sort of quick release system on both ends, a female to the tripod and a male to the camera. Now, I favor the Swiss Arca clamps and will never use anything made by Manfrotto again, simply because Manfrotto quick release clamps can release without my asking, and there are many reports of this on the web, so just be aware. So I personally prefer the clamps with traditional knobs for tightening as opposed to the lever type release. And some of my lever types can catch, the edge of a sleeve or something and release without permission, although I'm told by Really Right Stuff that their lever release, quick release clamps won't do that. But, I have yet to try one, but I have one on order just because I'll try it. Therefore, what this means right out of the starting gate is that I need to add a quick release clamp on the top of the rail to hold the camera, and then an Arca rail to the bottom of my focus rail. So I'm already adding things to the top and bottom of a focus rail, and the moment I do this, I start to introduce instability into the system. Sure, I can tighten them all down with Allen wrenches. However, some rails just have a 1/4-inch screw with a little knob underneath it for tightening that screw. That's really hard to get to. So it's very, very difficult to put a quick release clamp on this type of rail, because that knob tends to work loose and the whole thing swivels. So for starters, if I'm in that kind of situation, I need to apply some kind of paste like thread locker to the thread to keep it from moving around. Tight, stable functionality is required for rails. At least that's my view. Now, there are some rails that come with a built-in Swiss Arca rail on the bottom and a quick release Arca clamp on the top, but these are very few. Otherwise, as mentioned, we have to add the clamps, and each clamp that we add makes the whole setup less stable. The NovaFlex Castell Q does have an Arca style quick release clamp. However, their quick release clamp for some reason does not accept any of the Really Right Stuff or Kirk Enterprises quick release rails that I have, so it's useless. So I have no idea what standard they're using. Now, here are some general considerations in selecting a focus rail that you should be aware of. The first is two-way movement. Some focusing rails have two stages, one that moves forward and backward, and the other that moves from side to side, like you see in many microscope stages. Now, I have no use for these since I'm only interested in forward-backward movement. That's all that I use. Having two rails at right angle to one another, in my opinion at least, just adds another level of instability. I have one rail called the Velbon Super Mag Slider. And so I just undid the horizontal gear and set it aside. I would use only the backward-forward rail if I were to use that rail, but I don't use that rail for other reasons, which I'll get to. Point 2, vertical layers. This is a key point. As mentioned above, a key problem to be aware of is how many layers of stuff are you clamping or screwing on top of one another. For example, if a focusing rail has a 1/4-inch screw at the top, I'm not about to screw my camera base on or off that screw every time I use the rail. Therefore, I have to mount some kind of quick release clamp, and this immediately gives me one more layer of instability. It's easy to have a rail system of so many layers vertically, one on top of the other, that the whole thing wobbles at the slightest touch. So the principle is that every vertical layer we add tends to make the rail less stable. Now let's talk about weight. You might think that the weight of a rail is not important, whether it's light or heavy, but it's not true. Lighter ones are less useful to me. Therefore, the one that's made out of aluminum, like the NovaFlex Castell Mini, you would think it would be perfect because it weighs only like 0.63 pounds, 286 grams. But on the contrary, I find it very beneficial to have heavy rails whose own massiveness acts as a partial damper for the camera mirror and release. The Minolta rail is good and heavy in this way, as is the Olympus and a few others. It appears to me that I don't want to put something less substantial between my tripod and camera. It all should be solid, and heavy is good here. Vibrations. A lot of what we're talking about here comes down to just vibrations. Vibrations occur every single time that we touch a knob, every time we press the shutter release, and of course when we put the mirror up. Something that I do to measure the degree of vibration is to very gently rest the pad of one of my fingers against the rail or the tripod. I can feel every bit of vibration. Believe me, it's there, no matter how gently we move. And an assembly of rail parts that are lower, heavier, and more squat is what we're aiming at here. So let me just sum up what I've been telling you. This is the summary. Number one, the focusing knob must smoothly turn without requiring force that will make it jar or jump along the rail. Number two, the rail must move smoothly without sticking or sticking and then jumping, which is a common problem. Number three, the rail must neither move too slow or too fast at a given turn, and this may be a personal thing. Number four, the focusing rail should be heavy enough to act somewhat as a dampener. Number five, materials. Aluminum, at least in my opinion, is too light and soft a material. The best rails are metal, and heavy metal at that, like chrome-covered brass. 6. Hard plastic nylon gears can be good, provided they're handled carefully. They never need oiling, and they always work very smoothly. The Olympus rail has this, and I like it a lot. Number 7, the rail should be compact and as low to the tripod as possible. In other words, as mentioned earlier, as little vertical height as it's possible to get. Number 8, the rack must be lockable when used vertically. When we tilt the whole tripod, that thing has got to be locked cold. You're going to just have, lens creeping along, the whole thing moving along the rail without you asking it. And number 9, the rack must be strong enough to support the camera and lens without creeping, although this is difficult to get and still be able to move the rail forward. But, you experiment with it. It works out. There are different approaches to designing a rail. One of them being using 2 hollow tubes, another being some sort of solid central rail that's geared, and a third having a central screw attachment. Now with the tube style, if the tube style is made of aluminum or otherwise just too light, it tends not to dampen enough. However, if the tubes are chrome-covered brass or some such heavier metal, it can work fine. The central gear. My experience finds that the central geared rail, like in the Olympus and the NovaFlex Castell rails, This is a more stable arrangement for my work. Also, if this type has a hardened plastic geared rail, it seems to work smoothly and oillessly. You don't want a lot of oil on your rail because it's going to get on your fingers and on your lenses and whatever. And the last type that I'm aware of is the screw type. And this is really what machinists have. These are rails that have a central open screw that turns, moving the camera. Maybe this works well with very expensive rails designed for scientific microscopes, but on the lower end examples and really right stuff, which is usually great, I have to say is not so great here. These rails are just not good enough. Also, the open screw with oil on it invites you to touch it. Sooner or later you're going to bump into it, and you're going to transfer the oil to your fingers and then to who knows where. So this is not my favorite feature. And for some reason, most of these focusing rails are not inexpensive, and the cheap ones are not worth having, and you cannot judge the quality of a focusing rail by its price. In what follows here, I'm going to look at a few of the more common focusing rails. These are just my opinion of rails that I've actually tried out. And your take, could differ. So I offer this in the hope that it will save you the expense and frustration that I've gone through. If you just want to go out and buy one, here are 3 rails that I recommend. One is the NovaFlex Castel L, which is still available on B&H or someplace. Another nice one is the Olympus focusing rail, which is not available but can be occasionally found on eBay. And the third one is the Minolta focusing rail, which is no longer produced either, but you can find them on eBay once in a while. Let's look at the NovaFlex focusing rack mini. It's small. It weighs 0.63 pounds and has a maximum movement of 5.3 inches. Now, this design rests on 2 hollow aluminum tubes. I find the whole rig too light and unable to absorb much vibration, and just not, quote, good enough. Now I have one, but I never use it. The whole heft and feel of this rack is cheap and light. The rack gears on my copy are not smooth, but instead randomly jerk as you move along, even at the fine level. And at $248, this is not inexpensive. Now some of the other NovaFlex racks are fine, but this one, in my opinion, is really inferior, so I do not recommend this rail. The NovaFlex Castel Q. It weighs about 1 pound, has a maximum movement of 5.5 inches. The NovaFlex Castel focusing rails are much more solid, but only one of them is worth having, and that is called the Castel L focusing rack. It's the one shown here. This is the one with its own version of a quick release built in. But it's not quick, but it does work well. This is a very compact rail with an Arca-type bottom rail that goes right onto your tripod head. And it also has a round release 1/4 inch screw on the top that can be tightened into place with a small knob. No, it's not elegant, but this form of quick release actually works well. You will have to have an RSS or Kirk Enterprises quick release plate on top of the 1/4 inch screw, but that's all. So you're only adding one additional layer, the quick release plate. The price at B&H was $330, a lot of money. The NovaFlex also offers a 2-plane focusing rail that they call NovaFlex Focusing Rack Castel XL, which means heavy duty. It has the workable, removable 1/4 inch quick release plate that's the same one that's in the Castel L system above. So if you need a 2-level extendable rack, this would do a good job. Costs about $463. Now let's look at the NovaFlex Castel Q focusing rack. Weighs about 1 pound. Now the Castel Q focusing rack with an archetype quick release plate, it's a big disappointment, because the so-called archetype quick release plate won't accept any of the Kirk or Really Right Stuff quick release plates that I have. It just does not open quite wide enough. I have no idea what standard they were following, but as it is, it's unusable, and I had to send it back. Had it worked, it could have been the most solid and compact focusing rack I've seen. As it is, don't bother with it. They offer an adapter that takes you from the regular Arca style quick release, but what's the point of that? That would just be another layer. It costs $330. I don't recommend this type. Now the Valbon Super Mag Slider macro rail weighs about a pound. This is relatively inexpensive at $119, and it's just too cheap for my taste. The knobs don't turn smoothly, and the whole thing has too much vertical height, and it's clear that it's not heavy enough to dampen vibrations. It gets some good reviews, but not one from me. Now let's look at the Olympus focusing rail. The Olympus rack is like one of my favorites. It's heavy, non-greasy, and the nylon gears are as smooth as silk. It's hard to find. Its two level rails allow a wide range of extension. Now, for some work it's my overall favorite, but it's not as compact as the NovaFlex Castel L, which is the one that I really use all the time. However, if you can find an Olympus rack, they're rare. Sometimes on eBay, you have to be quick. I love my copy. You know, it feels solid, works smoothly, and it's heavy enough to absorb vibrations. The plastic or nylon gears on it require no oil and work perfectly. You don't want to oil them. The two-level stage allows me a very long arm of travel, should I need it. Now let's look at the Really Right Stuff macro focusing rail. And I'm just going to sum this up. You know, this rail looks good, it's built well, I love Really Right Stuff, and it has the smooth tooling that we've come to expect from Really Right Stuff. However, and I'm not alone in this appraisal, in this product they missed the boat. This design is fashioned on some of the more highly expensive microscope focusing devices, you know, ones that have a central oil-covered screw. And I found the oil, well, oily. And when I accidentally touched it while trying to focus my camera, it just got worse. I found that the focusing knob also was not smooth, but intermittently slightly jerky. It's something that I just cannot tolerate in a rail. It's got to be smooth. So overall, I was disappointed and returned the rail. But mostly I love RSS stuff, but just not this one. Now the Minolta focusing rail. The Minolta rail can only be found on eBay because it's been long out of print, and it's no longer manufactured. It uses chrome-plated brass tubes and it's quite heavy, which makes for good dampening. The gears are very smooth and the whole device is well designed. It has a sense of heft and quality about it. You do have to add a quick release plate on the top and a rail at the bottom, but even then I feel that this is a very solid and useful rail. And just to sum this up, mostly I use the Castel, the NovaFlex Castel L for everything I do, or a bellows. I like bellows more and more of the time.